Don't apply the same controls for every non-conformity because your organization will not thank you for it. So take my learnings.
Yeah. Do learn from my mistakes, right? This is what every parent I think wants to do. I'm not a parent, but it seems like that's what I've heard.
Don't do that. Do
Don't
this.
do that. Yeah.
Hello and welcome back to Quality Coffee Break. Now, this time we are talking about the risk-based approach, so risk-based thinking. So before we begin, we just really want to sort of highlight what we're not talking about is risk management in terms of the 14971 sense, but what we're talking about is how you may apply a risk-based approach throughout your organization when you're developing processes.
Yeah, this is a real hot topic lately because, as everybody probably knows by now, the FDA recently updated their quality management regulation. So it's now called QMSR, and it incorporates ISO 13485 into that regulation. And the early inspections are coming out, and risk is the hot topic. And it's about how it's using risk. It seems like they're using risk to drive the inspections. They're following up on how every company has applied risk-based thinking and risk approaches in like all the stuff that they do. So throughout the QMS, risk needs to feature quite heavily and prominently. And when it doesn't, people are getting cited for it.
Yeah, it feels like a bit of a catchphrase, doesn't it? Like, what's the risk? Risk-based approach. It feels like one of these catchphrases that you hear quality professionals talking about quite a lot. So what we really want to dive down to in this podcast is breaking that down, what that actually means practically when you're looking at documentation controls, when you're looking at infrastructure, when you're looking at supplier management, things like that. What does the risk-based approach actually mean in practice when you're developing these processes?
Absolutely. So let's start at the top. What do you think is the appropriate way to incorporate risk into, say, the document control system?
Now, this is something which I hold my hands up and admit, first time around the block, I did not do this appropriately. You go in very risk averse and you say like, hey, everybody needs to approve this document. We want all the technical functions involved in this. However, when you look at the structure of a quality management system in most organizations, you have your policies, your quality manual. Next step is your SOPs, and then you've got your work instructions and forms. So what you can actually do in this regard is take the risk-based approach to who's actually going to be approving those types of documentation based on what it is. So for example, I would expect people who are responsible for processes are signing off on the SOPs. However, when you get down to work instructions, I think probably a better way to do this is to go with individuals who are using the process on a day-to-day basis, who might have a few additional responsibilities, in terms of having appropriate technical knowledge. Obviously, if you've fulfilled your hiring process properly, check out our previous episode on this, then you will know that they've fulfilled what they need to do in terms of being an appropriate approver for that work instruction.
Exactly. I do the same thing. I think it's important when you're talking about policies. These are these high level policies. That's where you need to have, say, your C-suite involved in the approvals. But they really shouldn't be involved in the forms, approving the forms, right? So it's right sizing that based on the risk that particular document has on the QMS and the product.
Absolutely, couldn't agree more. So we started off with section 4 here, because we like to work in a in a good way around these things. So section 4 obviously also talks about outsourced processes. Now linking this to purchasing. Suzy, how would you apply a risk-based approach for purchasing and monitoring your outsourced processes?
Yeah, a great question. I think it starts with supplier quality. So if you're talking about bringing on a new supplier, somebody who is either going to supply a product or a service, you apply that risk-based thinking to those qualifications, those supplier qualifications. So what is it that this supplier is going to provide? How much of an impact does that have on your product itself or your QMS or other critical functions? Because, I mean, you could be talking about your ERP system, you could be talking or you could be talking about a consultant who advises on legal matters. They're going to have different impacts on the product itself. So we kind of do everything with like a rubric, as in what these are the, we're going to use maybe two or three different elements that you're going to assess and say, where does this fall on the impact to the product? Where does this fall on impact to the quality management system? Where does this fall in terms of risk to the organization, even from like a financial risk? Is it a big spend or is it a small spend? What's their quality history? If you know, do you know that this is a well-regarded organization, or is it, you're talking about like maybe a Fortune 500 company versus a small company that's local to you. And I think you need to apply different risks to those, which then in turn, I think results in different controls that you apply to a supplier, right? So the risk is part of it and you're applying a risk, but what you're doing with that risk is implementing a different level of control. Is this a supplier that needs a supplier audit? Is this a supplier that needs maybe a questionnaire or that kind of thing, or nothing?
I think so. You just highlighted a really good point, because in that example that you just gave, you're not just talking about what the risk is to the product. So, where we get that information from the risk management process, process FMEA likely, but you're actually talking about business risk there. And that is very dependent on the organization, isn't it? So
Yes.
not only should you be thinking about what the risk is to the product and the QMS, but does your business actually have financial risks that they're not willing to take until a certain threshold has been met? I think this is particularly prevalent for smaller businesses, startup businesses, where you are more reliant on investor funding and you don't have anything on the market yet. So you are naturally more conservative with spend. So I think that's a really good point that you've just made there, Suzy.
Thanks. And then of course you also have to then deal with your purchased product. And if what you're buying from this supplier, and that's kind of where those controls come into place too. If you're buying something that has a huge impact on your product, do you have controls in place so that when you receive the incoming material, are you doing additional testing on it? Or are you relying on a certificate of conformance or the paperwork that comes with it when you purchase it? So those are kinds of methods that you can adjust based on the risk of the proportionate risk based on the product or service that they're providing.
Absolutely. So I think that although at the beginning of this podcast we say, hey, this isn't anything to do with risk management, I think what we all need to bear in mind is that the risk-based approach is based, excuse me for using based again, on the outputs of your FMEA, in terms of your process FMEA, in terms of your product risk management, because that is going to tell you, in terms of this critical material, if we get this specification wrong, guys, this isn't going to work. So we need to make sure that we are looking out for these things within incoming goods. Those additional testing that you mentioned, Suzy, that might be from, we've been monitoring our product, and I've had this before. My goodness, our process FMEA said, hey, we need to make sure that we've got, this particular specification. Specification came in, all fine, we're using it. And then we're getting non-conforming product, and we can't figure out what it is. And then obviously you do your root cause analysis and you find, oh, actually there was something else there, which we need to look out for in terms of our incoming goods process. So that actually upped the ante in terms of the amount of controls that we were applying to that incoming goods process. So as always, this is something which is constantly moving. So making sure that you are monitoring your processes, monitoring your product because you may actually find that the controls that you started with need a little bit of adjustment to check, to monitor for things which might be actually changing.
Yeah, and you also, I mean, you started the question by asking about outsourced processes in general, and I sort of hijacked it and went right to supplier quality. Outsourced processes can mean a lot of things, right? Because you can outsource your manufacture of your product. You can outsource design of your product. You can outsource, the cleaning activities if, for your clean room, or you can outsource. So all of those outsourced activities, well, there's of which there are so many. They need their own individual evaluation.
Yeah.
And what's appropriate for this particular process that you've outsourced versus another.
Yeah, so what I do is I think about what section of the standard is this outsourced process for. So I can relate it to whether it's a direct process, so section 6.4 onwards, or it's an indirect, section 4 to section 6.3, because automatically that lets me know, hey, if it is just for, so an EQMS system, I would classify that as long as it didn't do any, manufacturing process monitoring or anything like that. I would classify that as an indirect process, because that's documentation management, all of that kind of thing. So management of documents and records. So automatically there you sort of like know the risk classification for that would be lower than, say, a piece of automated manufacturing software. Automatically that's higher risk than your EQMS system. So there you can actually look at the controls that are proportionate. And we have spoke about the FDA guidance document on that, so I'm not going to get onto that again, but that's also worth a look when it comes to looking at how risky a piece of software is in terms of your QMS.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, what's next on the list in terms of processes or yeah.
I would say, looking at validation and infrastructure and
Okay.
things like that. Validation and infrastructure. So, you need a piece of equipment and it's for R&D. All right. So, you purchase it off the shelf. What's the risk? Well, depending on how tightly your organisation actually wants to monitor R&D and how tightly controlled it wants to be, probably not a lot. If it's a balance, it might be a good idea to get it calibrated every now and then and maintained. But, other organisations could take a completely different approach to this and be like, it's R&D, slap a sticker on it, research use only, and then you're good to go. However, I think that raises a good point of when you move through product realisation and, hey, this is now a really critical piece of equipment, you're going to need to make sure that you're calibrating it, making sure your weights are calibrated, for example. A balance is just a really good example. Maybe you actually need to do, a calibration check before you use it. It might be that critical. Your process FMEA, your process risk management is identified that critical that you need to check every single time. And then when you're buying a new piece of equipment, say for, a piece of validated production line, you need, can't think of a good example at the moment, but you need like something which fills vials, for example. There we go. Something that fills vials. So that there are going to be certain elements of that which are going to need to have, a URS high priority in terms of when it comes to the business. But you're also going to be able to leverage what you've got already from the supplier. So there might be some sort of factory acceptance testing, SAT, site acceptance testing that you can leverage. However, when you pop it into your process, there's going to be that additional thing that you're going to need to do to make sure that it fits and that your vials are, all have, for example, 5 ml of liquid in each one. So in terms of when it comes to a risk-based approach for pieces of equipment, just thinking about what it's actually used for. What is actually useful? What stage of product realization is this useful? And then going forward.
Yeah, that's a great example. And I think your point about R&D is a good one. And I think also there comes a point in every startup's life where they have to think about how R&D starts to influence or become part of the commercial operation, or when you have your site is not just R&D, and you've got some production, and you've got some R&D spots. And so I think about storage units. I think about refrigerators and freezers a lot because, again, you can easily say research use only. We're not going to do a big, temperature mapping exercise for this refrigerator that is used for research and development. However, what happens when you lose when a refrigerator goes down in your production area, and then you're like, oh, but we have this refrigerator in R&D that we can use, and we can move our product over there and store it there temporarily while we get this one fixed. And then it's like, okay, but also you haven't fully validated the R&D one. So I think there is a point in every startup's life where they start to have to treat R&D a little bit more like production, just so that you have that comfort and you can use it as a backup, and you're helping yourself. You're helping your future self.
Oh,
And you don't know it yet.
oh, absolutely. I couldn't agree more with you. It's such a delicate balance. We might be getting a little bit off topic, but I think this is still relevant. It's a really delicate balance between giving R&D that space, that flexibility that they need so they can really get down, and do the work, between, implementing that control, which we know is needed when you get for the later phases of your design development process. So they're going too much into design development, you can, all organizations are required to separate their design development phases. It could be, 2 phases, it could be 3 phases, it could be 8 phases. It depends on the organization. So some organizations will do the R&D, and then when it gets to verification, design validation, then that's the point where all the control goes. However, some companies might do this on a sort of a bite-sized approach. So they might want to have a kind of a pre-design validation, pre-design verification stages, so they know when they get to, proper design validation, design verification, that they're pretty much certain that they're going to pass everything. So they may be implementing those more rigorous, equipment controls, more rigorous process controls at an earlier stage. Just depends on the product. And in my opinion, I think a more complex product, you're going to want to introduce more of the quality controls in earlier than if it was kind of like a sort of a basic product, in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree. If we move outside of, because then when you get into the meat of the product realization, you're talking about risk management, right? So we're going to skip right over that and and maybe move to clause 8, where we're talking about monitoring and measuring, right? So what do you think about like I always think about our CAPA system. I guess it's sort of one of my favorite systems, but
Such a quality professional. I love that.
right.
Such a true QA.
I love a good CAPA system. But how do you apply the risk-based approach, or how have you seen, because again, we've all had experience with many different organizations, but what are some of the effective ways or more effective ways you've seen risk-based thinking take hold in that CAPA management system?
So, very good point. I'm going to start with how I did it wrong, because
okay. Important lessons.
Important lessons, because this is what this is all about. So the first time I implemented a QMS, I didn't apply the risk-based approach very well at all in terms of when it came to a CAPA system, because I feel like I just need to apologise to everybody that was involved in that, because I feel like I just doubled everybody's workload. But, it was, if you had a deviation, or non-conformity, it was a full-on, root cause analysis and corrective actions. So you can see why maybe that wasn't completely, effective, because, I was just applying the same control to anything that went wrong. So it was just too onerous. So the way that I've done it now, so learn from my mistake, don't do that, because it's not effective. Think about, okay, we're going back to our indirect and our direct processes, and we're going back to, the frequency of occurrence. So if you can think about direct processes as being high severity, and then your indirect processes are being low severity. Again, we touched on this on CAPA, but I'm just going to summarize this part. So if you had a non-conformity and it was against, I don't know, section 4, so you got an indirect process and it's the first time that's happened, a correction. Maybe just document it. Oh, hey, this happened. Just a little correction. Done. Bish bash bosh. However, if you've got a few instances of, people might call them quality events, so this wasn't documented, this wasn't signed off by the right person, whatever. So you can monitor, so now we're getting into monitoring of our processes, how often that is coming. Oh, well, actually, maybe that is becoming a bit of a problem. Maybe our training isn't clear for this. Oh gosh, maybe our procedures aren't great for this. So then that's would be the time when that would be appropriate to move into root cause analysis and then corrective action. So that's kind of how I really, really feel about it. Don't apply the same controls for every non-conformity because your organisation will not thank you for it. So take my learnings.
Yeah. Do learn from my mistakes, right? This is what every parent I think wants to do. I'm not a parent, but it seems like that's what I've heard.
Don't do that. Do this.
Don't do that. Yeah. But I also take it another step further. I think if you are struggling with the concept of direct or indirect, or you haven't incorporated that into your quality management system, there's another way that you can look at this, and you can look at every instance, every quality event or nonconformance or deviation or whatever your word for it is, and use a little rubric right for that one and say, how severe is this error? And how detectable is this error? Those are the two measures that I use personally when I'm looking at these things. Like if it's a severe problem but highly detectable and is like part of the process and you're going to get it's going to be caught sort of reliably every time, then your corrective actions maybe don't have to be as substantial because you've already designed the process to prevent release of a product that has this sort of enormous failure. But if you have something that is pretty severe, but you don't have an opportunity to detect it built into your process, that's going to need more. That's going to inform your root cause analysis, like the depth that you might go to your root cause analysis and the types of corrective actions or preventive actions that you're going to put in place. And then if you have something that's really critical, then I even add a second effectiveness check to those events. So if you have something that was like, a big deal problem that's high on the severity or and low on detectability or whatever it might be, and you're like, this is critical, we need to put all our resources towards correcting this issue, I'm gonna want to see an effectiveness check sort of in the short term after you've implemented your corrective actions, and then I want to see an extended or a sustained effectiveness check that might be sometime later, 6 months later, or whatever it might be. I want to see that the actions that we've put in place continue to be effective and are being performed as expected 6 months down the road, because this was a really big deal that we don't want to ever see happen again.
Is a great top tip. Love it. Great top tip. I think from my perspective, we've covered those are the main areas for your risk-based thinking. That risk-based approach 1345 is trying to tell you about.
I do have one more.
Oh, go for it.
Training effectiveness.
Oh, that's a doozy. Go for it, Suzy.
And I think it is called out in the standard. I think it's one of those that says, proportionate to the risk. So this kind of goes back to how you've categorized your documents or however you do your training in your organization. But there are obviously going to be levels, those that are just read and understand versus those that might have like a competency assessment. That's sort of your measure of training effectiveness, and it is proportionate to the risk when you think about what is the what is the impact of this particular process that we're training on our finished product or on our QMS or on our critical systems. And then if it's sufficiently high, we need to do something a little bit different. Read and understand may not be enough for this particular document. And maybe it's I need to have a supervisor sign off that you're capable of doing this on your own, or maybe it's that you are doing a test or a quiz to test your knowledge and your application of that information, or maybe it's a full-on observation of that activity being performed. But that is a really clear example of applying your risk-based thinking in the development of your process and how you execute it.
Love that. I think as well with risk-based thinking, it's iterative. So the controls that you apply at the start are going to be different to controls that are in place a year, 2 years, away from that point. So one thing I keep saying is there is a reason why Section 8 is there. There's a reason. Because you're not going to get it right, right first time, every time. It's just not possible. This is why we are monitoring our product, monitoring our processes to see how well they're doing with the controls applied. If we're finding that, for example, Suzy, in your example with training, we may be like, okay, well, we've got like a supervised, for a couple of trainings. But then, we're finding actually maybe that training isn't as effective as it needs to be. Maybe additional supervision or, presenting the training material in a different way would be more beneficial. So I think, in line with our don't panic, read the SOP, don't panic because Section 8 is there to help you out. So if you don't get it right first time, it's fine. When it comes to an audit situation, I will maintain that as long as you can demonstrate that you're, doing the risk-based approach, maybe utilizing these methods that we've spoken about, and you're monitoring your processes, and then you're changing them when you realize, actually, maybe that's not good enough. You're there. It's absolutely golden. I can't see an auditor having any problems with that whatsoever.
Yeah, and I want to bring up, because you mentioned audits a little bit, or as part of, Section 8, right? Monitoring and measuring in your audit activities. I mean, your internal audits are key for identifying these issues. Like when maybe when your risk-based approach doesn't quite hit the nail on the head for a given process, you can find, again, your internal audit process is a huge tool to demonstrate how you are in control of your processes, because you're finding the issues before it becomes a big deal, and you're doing this in lots of different ways, and the internal audit is one of them. And then also you can apply your risk-based thinking to your internal audit program itself as well, because you can do it where you hit every station on a given cycle, and it's just one after another, and this is how you roll through it, and that works, and that's good, and you're ensuring that the whole system is assessed on a regular frequency. Or you can also apply risk-based thinking to your audit scheduling and say, I'm going to evaluate the data and the inputs from your management reviews and from your CAPA system and from your complaint system and all these other systems, and say, and maybe even looking at process FMEAs or DFMEAs, and say, okay, these sections need a higher frequency of evaluation. So my internal audit schedule for this half of the system needs to be more frequent, and then this half of the system where it has less of an impact, or it's a lower risk, maybe we do that on a different frequency. And so you can, as long as you justify it and you write it down and you are making these decisions based on sound data, you can, you have the world's your oyster. You can sort of do whatever you want.
Love that. I love that. I mean, that is a perfect example of how to meet that requirement, isn't it? Because, the whatever section 8 point something, 8.4, internal audit. Yeah, well, I'll go with that. 8.4 internal audits. It says that you need to apply the risk-based approach to how often like you schedule and the frequency to internal audit. So yeah, management reviews, CAPAs. If there's been a change in process as well, you might want to consider, well, actually, people really fully understood this. So I think those are all excellent examples.
Yeah, and I think you'll find that it does naturally get embedded into the different systems and processes within your quality management system. Everything from document control to change control to CAPAs to supplier quality, all of it. When you are effectively incorporating that risk-based thinking into your organizational philosophies, it just shows up in all the systems sort of naturally. So that's what you're aiming for. So when you're starting from scratch and you're writing procedures and policies that have never existed before, that's when you probably need to do the most thinking about how are we incorporating our risk-based thinking or a risk-based approach. But after you get going, it just kind of finds its way into everything.
Absolutely. I think that's maybe a little bit of homework for individuals who may be new to quality. Maybe you're a quality officer and don't really understand how the risk-based approach is applied in your QMS. Have a look at your procedures. I reckon you'll be able to find something pretty easily. I would say, yeah, start off with, Section 8 procedures, your CAPA, going through validation. I reckon you'll find something there which will just scream at you, oh, this is how we're actually doing the risk-based approach. And all will become clear.
Yeah, I've even seen some suggestions, which I think is interesting and be curious. I have never implemented it, but something that's kind of on my radar to think about. People adding a section to the SOPs that are like the risk considerations for whatever SOP that you're talking about, which I think is a really great idea.
Oh, right. So what, hang on, right. So what,
I don't know.
practically, like,
I
this
haven't,
interests me.
I mean, I haven't done it, so I
Right.
don't have like top tips for you. Um,
Damn.
but I think, I mean, part of it could be also satisfying that obligation to ensure that the people who are performing the processes understand what happens if they do the process wrong, right? Like what's the
Right.
risk to the
Okay.
product? So
Yeah,
you
yeah.
can say like, okay, so if if your balance is, so your risk considerations in a manufacturing, like batch record or that kind of process, you might say, okay, well, your equipment has to be calibrated. Otherwise, you risk not having the correct amount of the active ingredients in your product, and it is going to be less effective, or whatever. You could also probably say, if you're looking at, say, supplier quality again, your risk considerations would be, you're risking an ineffective material that's provided, or you're risking an ineffective process that is incorporated, which then takes more resources and time to manage. I'm not exactly sure, Amy, on how I would do this. Um, like I said, it's a thought that's just been sort of
I just,
back
yeah,
here.
I love it. I mean, this is what this is for, right? I was just
Yeah.
thinking, okay, so like supplier, that's a good one. So, you could have a little section at the bottom and just says, hey guys, just, think about what this supplier is providing, right?
Yeah,
And
or maybe you just like write out your thinking on how you've applied the risk-based
oh,
approach
right,
in
yeah.
each one of those SOPs, like risk considerations, like by we are evaluating the risk of the materials impact on the finished product or the supplier's service on the finished product by using this rubric.
Like that, because when your auditor comes around, it's just like, oh, demonstrate to me, because this is how they talk. Demonstrate to me that you've applied a risk-based approach. I mean, that's how I talk when I do an
Yeah.
audit.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you could literally just go to your procedures and be like, it's there, it's there. I like that. That's
Yeah.
good.
I mean, it's an
I
idea.
think it's I think it's a top tip.
Uh, I'll have to take my own advice on it. I have not done it yet, but like
Yeah.
I think it could be really interesting. Or maybe even if it's just at like certain document levels, you know,
SOPs.
at the SOPs.
Yeah, I reckon SOPs. So for me, the way that I implement QMSs is that your SOPs address how 1345 is met, and then your work instructions will be like, if you're using a computer system, click the screen, do this, put this in, very sort of step by step instructions. So yeah, I reckon an SOP would be the best way, just to kind of have that sort of level.
Yeah, if you have if your document structure has that sort of hierarchy, that would be good. Or you could also do a total, you could probably have an individual document that is like your risk-based
Ah,
thing.
like a summary of the risk based approach. Hey, why don't you just even just whack it in your quality manual?
I mean, you could whack it in your quality manual.
Yeah.
You could, or elements of it probably do
Yeah.
belong throughout, right? Because you
Yeah.
want to demonstrate how seriously you've taken this risk-based
Yeah.
thinking.
You know what? I would put it in my quality manual because, quality manuals are great, aren't they? Because they just essentially follow the standard. Like, "Oh, this is how we do
Yeah.
document control, blah, blah, blah." And then you have a couple of sentences on there. The risk-based approach is applied by blah, 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 blah. I think that would be a really nice sort of way to do it. Yeah.
So that could be your high level, and then, but in your SOP, if you wanted to, you could say we're using the risk-based approach or thinking by assigning categories for X, Y, and Z in this
Hmm.
process, or
Yeah.
we're if it's your kappa process, we're evaluating each event for its severity and for its detectability, and that is how we are incorporating our risk-based thinking for this particular case, because you wouldn't want all of that into your quality manual because that would get too long. But you
Hmm.
can have your high level, and then you can have the more specific examples or specific applications of it in the
Yeah.
down tier documents.
Yeah. Considering you didn't know how to implement it like 5 minutes ago, I feel like we've just worked it out.
Maybe, maybe that's how we do it.
We just worked it out. So bish bash bosh, there we go. Live thinking here.
Well,
On
I
the
think that's,
podcast.
again, that is
Love
what
it.
a quality team does,
Mm.
right? It's a lot of brainstorm in my experience, and I think in like the best possible way, it's a lot of brainstorming together.
Yeah, the amount of times I've been like, does this make sense? If I did this, would this make sense to you? And then you can have a nice little conversation about it. But yeah, teamwork. I mean, you can't lead quality on your own, can you? It's a group effort. Group effort, absolutely. Um, right. So a little sidetrack there, but I think that was really worth it. It was absolutely, yeah, it was a really good discussion. But until next time.
Don't panic. Read the SOP.